Today's lesson is about the basics of federal government budgeting. So in terms of budgeting, the government spends money and receives money in terms of taxes. And so in terms of spending, the government has really three options in terms of how revenues and expenditures meet. So a budget surplus is when the government spends less than they receive in tax revenues. So they're going to end up having some leftover money at the end of the year that, as consumers, we'd call that savings, and for the government, running a surplus. A budget deficit is when their spending is greater than their tax revenues. So when the government deficit spends, they're going to have to borrow money, which we'll talk about later on in fiscal policy, the effects of borrowing money through deficit spending. Or the government can have a balanced budget, whereas they spend exactly what they make in tax revenues. So there's no addition to the federal debt. Now, there is a difference between the deficit and the debt. All of these options, the surplus, the deficit, or balanced budget, are for 1 year of budgeting. Overall, we have the federal debt, and that is the addition of all of the surpluses and deficits from past years added together into one large number that's the debt. So if we look at this chart for the federal budget deficits and surplus, we notice that most years since the beginning of this chart in 1968, most years are deficit spending years. So America has a pretty sizable debt because of all of these deficits. We ran some surpluses, as you can see, in the early 60s. There were some, and then not again until the mid-90s expansion under Clinton, and then continuing on to some surpluses in the early 2000s before 9/11, which began the deficit spending here through the war period times, and then as the war started to kind of make way, then there was less spending. And then with the Great Recession of 2008, we have the great leap in government deficit spending to help get us out of the Great Recession. And then in the waning periods of the recession, we have a decrease in the government deficit. We'll talk about the effects of these in fiscal policy later on in our macroeconomics units. But for now, just kind of looking at most years, the government does run a deficit, and so therefore, we do have an overall debt in society. So here's a look at the overall debt as it's been added to since 1937, and it's kind of labeled, you can see, by presidents, and red being the Republicans and blue being the Democrats. So you can kind of see through the 60s, not much is added to the overall debt in terms of what has been done recently since the 80s. You can see that Reagan adds to the debt and starts kind of the debt climbing. Carter raises it a little bit as well, but Reagan has a pretty large impact. Clinton then, with the surplus years, kind of levels off as he runs a few surpluses through the 90s because of the expansion of the United States, mostly. And then Bush, because of the 9/11 and the war, adds to deficit spending, and then with the Great Recession, Obama was forced to use expansionary policy to help us out, and so the debt has risen greatly in the last 30 or so years compared to what it once was. So where does the federal government get its tax revenue from? In 2015, they received $3.2 trillion in tax revenues from various taxes that they collect, the vast majority of which, or at least the plurality in this case, is the individual income tax, account for about $1.5 trillion each year. Then they have other things like payroll taxes that they collect, the corporate income tax rates as well. We see a small little bit of excise taxes like on gasoline or cigarettes or any other federal excise tax. And then customs duties in terms of imports. So you can see that that accounts for a very small fraction, $37 billion, in a much larger pot of $3.2 trillion collected. And then some other miscellaneous ways that the federal receives money accounts for a small percentage as well. So for the most part, the federal government spends money that we give them as individuals. Now, spending in 2015 was $3.8 trillion. So if we compare that to the $3.2 trillion in revenues, we would notice that the government had a budget deficit of $600 billion. Or, to keep the math simple, a budget deficit of $0.6 trillion, as 3.2 million minus 3.8 trillion would be $0.6 trillion. So what the government spends their money on is they spend a lot of money, 33% on Social Security, unemployment, and labor compensations, another 27% for medical care and health, $600 billion in the military, in one of the largest military spending countries in the world. Because they have debt, they have interest to pay on that debt. So about $230 billion a year is spinning the wheel on the debt and just forcing that over. Then we have some other, one of the smaller ones. Education, for the most part, is left up to the states. Some transportation, housing and community, international affairs, energy and the environment, subsidies, and then science, research, and development, a small portion as well. So just to kind of give you a sense of when you give the federal government their money in taxes, for the most part, if you have a job, you're paying your payroll and individual income taxes. This is where your money is going to. We're going to talk about later on in fiscal policy the difference between automatic and discretionary stabilizers for government spending. So there's some things the government automatically has to pay, like things like welfare, where, as many people qualify for welfare, there's no new law that's created. So of the new laws, the new spending that they create and that they talk it over in the House and the Senate and goes to the President, of the spending they're in control of, they spent $1.1 trillion in spending. And you can see 54% of that went to military spending in terms of what they decided to actually spend their money on. They spend money on government, education, medical and healthcare, veterans benefits, and then some other smaller numbers. But you can see that what the government decides to spend money on is mostly military. And again, the education realm is much smaller because, for the most part, states fund education. So overall, to be an active citizen in the United States, a cursory knowledge at least of what the government collects in terms of revenue and how much they spend and what they spend it on is important to kind of keep track of, so that way you can lobby your local, state, or federal government in terms of, what you want them to be spending your money on. Because ultimately, your tax dollar gets lumped in with a lot of other people's, but we still need to think about an efficient allocation of that tax revenues and subsequent government spending.